So first of all, just a wee bit of background. We have a new Prime Minister, a new leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party, Boris Johnson. We're all aware of that. Good political anoraks, followers of the European press will be aware of this fact. But who is he? A wee bit about his profile. Boris Johnson is a two-time Mayor of London, Conservative Mayor of London. That's really important. It tells you an awful lot about his politics. He's not an especially conservative. He really is quite progressive on pretty much most measures and most indices. That's how he won, being mayor twice in a row of a very progressive city, a very diverse city like London. So that's a bit of his background. He's Oxford educated, he's upper middle class, he's charismatic, he has developed a persona, some might say a shtick, a kind of a patter, which is an admixture of a bumbling public schoolboy and also someone who carries his classical learning really quite at the forefront of his conversation. So he's trying to kind of look down, say I'm just a regular kind of guy and I'm a little bit disorganised and dishevelled, and at the same time he's quoting the classics at journalists and things like that in a rather disarming way. So underestimate Boris Johnson at your peril, I think, is what we can learn from that. He's not just some bumbling, twit from sort of like the upper middle classes. He's a very pragmatic and shrewd operator, and someone who's managed to get to the top of the Conservative and Unionist Party and be elected just by their membership that has 160,000 people, and the vast majority are pretty right-wing and pretty Eurosceptic, and having been a two-time mayor of the most progressive city in the UK, that is not a politician to be trifled with, I think, whether we agree with his policies or not. So he's interesting, and I give a little illustration. Just before the referendum, he wrote a piece in a broadsheet newspaper where he seemed to be weighing up the benefits of Leave or Remain. Well, so what? You might think, what's germane about that? My point is, he's not a true believer. He's not a true believer in the sense that he entered Parliament as a dyed-in-the-wool Eurosceptic. He's someone who's come to this position. And in my opinion, I think he sees pros and cons in Britain's membership with the EU, and I think that's a very fair point. But I think he's also someone who saw that his ambition and the direction of travel for him was going to be best served by coming out for the Leave campaign and being one of their main figures. So that's, I think, and also a little important point when we're just trying to get a sense of who he is. So he is critical of the EU, but for most of his career, he was certainly someone who was constructive with the EU, and he was a big supporter of EU trade as well. So what's his mandate? Well, critics are very clear that he doesn't have a mandate, there's been no general election. Well, that's a very weak and shaky historical argument. Gordon Brown was coronated by Labour MPs, okay? And he was a Labour Prime Minister, and no one was saying those kind of things about him. So the Conservatives had a mandate. They were the largest party just at the 2017 general election, and they have been until this morning in a position where they had a majority with the support of Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party, but they have no overall majority as of this morning because Dr. Philip Lee crossed the floor of the House of Commons and is now, poof, a Liberal Democrat. As if you can just kind of switch from being the Conservative and Unionist Party to the Liberal Democrats. But some politicians find a way. And so the government actually does not have an overall working majority. So it's a minority government. So you might argue, what's his mandate? His mandate is he's been put there by the membership of the Conservative Party. And that is both legitimate, because he wins a legitimate debate against Jeremy Hunt. He becomes the leader of the Conservative Party, and he automatically becomes the primus inter pares. he automatically, don't worry about it, someone last time had the Mission Impossible tune on their phone. And when my friends watched it on YouTube, they thought it was really fun. It went off 3 times. So it's Mission Impossible 1 and Mission Impossible 2, Mission Impossible 3. It's okay. It's okay. And so he becomes Prime Minister de facto because the Conservatives are the government of the day. So he has a mandate, so we mustn't have any of this, he's not legitimate. He's bona fide, he has a mandate. Tactics, strategies, and timetables. Tactics, strategies, and timetables. Prorogation. Prorogation is a prerogative power. Her Majesty the Queen closes a parliamentary session on the advice of her First Minister, the Prime Minister. That's what she did a few days back at the advice of Boris Johnson, and so we are going to have a Queen's speech which commences a new parliamentary session. Queen's speeches happen about once a year. We actually haven't had one since 2017, so we are very much due for a new parliamentary session. And we also have a new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and a new government. There's been a big cabinet reshuffle, and he quite legitimately wants to set out his agenda and talk about things away from just Brexit, like funding for police and funding for the NHS and issues of knife crime in London and all sorts of things. And so in that sense, it's entirely legitimate. But ladies and gentlemen, let's not be under any illusion. He has done this solely to take time out of the parliamentary timetable for members of the House of Commons to have less time to debate the problems and the drawbacks, as they see it, and the pitfalls of a no-deal Brexit. Because as we stand now, it won't be the same if I was giving this talk tomorrow evening, I would imagine. As we stand right now, the law says that the United Kingdom exits the European Union on Halloween, with all the ghosts and ghouls and bumps in the night that might go along with that, on the 31st of October. As the law stands today, at 12:15 Pacific time. And so I think it's incontrovertible fact that a Prime Minister has used an entirely legitimate constitutional mechanism, prorogation, and the Queen has just responded, because Her Majesty can't get involved in the grubby nature of politics. That's the masterstroke of constitutional monarchy, that is not monarchy in that absolute sense, that you have to be above the fray. And I can't think of any situation where Her Majesty could not have said, actually, no, I don't think so, you let those Remainers have a bit more time. She just can't do that. That would have been a constitutional crisis. And whatever you think of monarchy and whatever you think of HM Queen, she's nothing if she's a stickler for tradition and the rule book. And I think she's been very dignified in doing that. How things go as the monarchy moves forward, I am much less certain, but make of that, ladies and gentlemen, what you will. Boris Johnson has deliberately taken time out. He's removed some time, not a lot, but a handful of days. Because what happens this time of year anyway, is that Parliament goes into another recess, only having just come back from the summer recess, summer vacation, because we have party conference season. So they go away for another 2-3 weeks, and that's, they're not in Parliament. Parliament's not sitting, because they're all campaigning and firing up their troops and trying to decide how they're going to win a next general election. But he has taken out time deliberately. It's a playbook of trying to run down the clock. And what's happening in Scotland right now, in the Court of Session in Edinburgh, is a legal challenge about this. It's being supported by Gina Miller, who was a multi-millionaire businesswoman who was behind the legal challenge a few years ago, contesting the Brexit situation and saying that Parliament should have a final vote, which the UK Supreme Court agreed. So she's funding this, and Sir John Major, former Prime Minister, he's waded into this. He's up to his waist in this, and the legal challenge. I think the former Prime Minister's Club probably met somewhere and they had a nice lunch. And they said, well, John, you do the legal bit, and we'll let Gordon do the, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to the union bit, and we'll let Tony come out and kind of self-flagellate about, yes, wasn't Iraq bad, but come on, this is really not a good thing. I appeal to everyone as good Europeans. This is not good. So I think the former PM, they've just got together and had some special lunch, and they've decided who's going to do what. But that's just my take on it. So there is a legal challenge. And then Dr. Philip Lee, MP for Bracknell in Berkshire, south of England, one of the home counties, with quite a comfortable majority actually. He's crossed the floor of the House. It's a huge deal. It's a big deal. It does not happen often. And it happened at the start of the afternoon session. He just walked across, flanked by 2 MPs, and instead of going to sit on the government benches, he went onto the opposition benches. It's a very visual, very public thing. It rams it home that actually it's not just him saying I'm a real Remainer and I've been for a second referendum, which he's been on the record for, entirely on the record for, and he represents a constituency which is Remain, majority Remain. So he's absolutely within his rights to do that, but I guess it's the fact that he thinks that the Conservative Party is no longer a place for him, which is a little bit like the leader of the Scottish Party, Ruth Davidson, resigning a few days ago. Now, she'd been trailing that, and in fairness, I think if you read between the lines, when Philip Lee had been interviewed a few months back, he'd been trailing that as well. Sort of saying, well, I want to... When people start talking about the need for a broad church, their party to be a broad church, you know what they mean. They feel that they're not kind of welcome anymore. But anyway, this has now made a huge difference because this government is no longer in majority. It's minority government. And they're having this emergency debate. And that was triggered because this morning Sir Oliver Letwin's motion was accepted by the Speaker of the House, John Bercow. Standing Order 24. Which means we'd like to have an emergency debate, please. And it's happening right now. It'll take 3 hours. At the end, there'll be a vote. If the vote is won, and I imagine it will be, because when it was put, members of the House of Commons had to stand up who supported it, and all the opposition benches stood up, and a good chunk of Tories stood up as well. I was watching it on BBC Live, BBC Parliament Live, and there was a good chunk of people who stood up. So I think you don't do that if you're in a Conservative government, and the Conservative government doesn't want this debate, unless you're willing pretty much to face the consequences. And I think what will happen will be that the government will lose that vote, and that means tomorrow there'll be a bill brought, and the bill will say that Article 50 has to be amended to the end of January, in other words, trump what we have in English law, which is we leave on Halloween, unless the Prime Minister can negotiate a deal with the EU, a la Theresa May's deal, but with the same sticking point of the Northern Irish backstop. And quite sensibly, we know, I think, from what the EU have said is, I don't think that's going to happen. I think the EU are being very sensible and rational about this. They're saying, well, no, you're still hopelessly divided. We've got a strong hand here. We're not going to open things up. So, Standing Order 24 was accepted. There is an emergency debate. There's some controversy about whether the Speaker should have allowed the debate. I mean, Standing Order 24, emergency debates, not usually for things that are already in law, but leaving that, he's a controversial figure, John Bercow. Whatever you made him, he's a controversial figure. Certainly, there was a majority in the House of Commons that wants this, and I can understand that. And the country's divided, and I can see why he went through it. But anyway, but is that the end of it? I don't think so. I think the government's going to, lose this bill tomorrow, lose the vote today, lose the vote on the bill tomorrow, and I think they will then try and call a general election. And for that to happen, they need a 2/3 majority in the House of Commons under the Fixed Term Parliament Act 2011. The Fixed Term Parliament Act isn't ready. It's like one of these things, you name something, you name an act, and it sort of like does the opposite of what it's meant the name says. It's like the Patriot Act. How patriotic is that? The Freedom Act. I think you're taking my freedom away. The Tax Relief Act. I think you're going to raise my taxes. The Fixed Term Parliament Act. Not really that fixed, is it really? I mean, tries to take away some of the straight prerogative power of the PM to call an election when the economy is ticking up. But really, it gives the government an opportunity, if a 2/3 majority can be secured, to go ask Her Majesty to dissolve Parliament and have an early election. I think that's what Dominic Cummings, the advisor to Boris Johnson, the guru behind Vote Leave, I think that's what he wants. Because he is sound on numbers, and I think he looks at Johnson's poll ratings versus Corbyn's. I think he thinks that that the Brexit party, under Farage and Boris, can do some kind of deal. They've lined up their 650 candidates already. Because if you can't line that deal up, they will be wreckers and they will split the right, centre-right vote. And I think he's also thinking that with a new, young female leader, Jo Swinson, the Liberal Democrats probably aren't going to step aside in many races, many constituency contests, with a hard left Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. So I think they're doing the electoral math and they're thinking if there is a general election, it might be a hung parliament again. It looks like we're a very divided country and we have been for a few cycles now. But also they're hoping that there's enough people in the Tory backbenches who are thinking if we don't vote for this, we'll have the whip taken away from us, the Tory whip taken away, so they'll have to sit as independents, and they might not even be allowed to stand as Conservatives. But for that to happen, the Labour Party will have to, some people in the Labour Party will have to vote for a general election. And Jeremy Corbyn has been arguing for a general election for the last year. So he's in a very tricky position. It's almost like the government are going to say, okay then, leader of the opposition, we're going to give you what you want. And now he's going to say, do you want what you want, you man of principle? Or do you actually, no, we don't want this. And I think Tony Blair, coming on TV last night, was saying, you can't have a general election now. The Labour Party mustn't fall into this. This is a bear trap. Because if they go for the general election and Boris wins the majority, you know, there'll be an opportunity. He'll just leave. The law says we leave on the 31st of October. The election will be before then. It'll eat through time, and then that will be that pretty much. You know, time's taken out because of the prorogation. Time's taken out because of conference season. Time will be taken out for a general election, and that's a trap. And I think Blair's reading of that is actually spot on. But the difficulty is that the Labour Party and the Labour Party activists want a Corbyn government, and they want their form of socialism, whereas a lot of the parliamentary Labour MPs are not. They are more like the new Labour kind of rump. They just want to stay in the EU, because for them, the EU is this normative, moral good project that keeps Britain safe and rich and free. Must admit, I think EU can be many things. It can be good for trade, it can be good for intergovernmentalism, it can be really good to fight climate change or transnational problems. But what the EU definitely does not do, it definitely does not keep Britain safe in any way, shape or form. I think that's NATO's job and Her Majesty's Vanguard class submarines. I mean, EU doesn't keep anyone's, although many EU federalists want an EU standing army. And I don't think, if it doesn't keep Britain safe, you can't really make an argument to say that the EU federal project of the EU keeps Britain free. We've had Magna Carta for a wee while. We've had the Bill of Rights since 1689. I don't really think you can make that argument. So many good things. You can talk about trade, you can talk about mutual benefit economically and working together at an intergovernmental level to solve problems that don't merely affect nation states. Absolutely right. It's a bit of a stretch to say that without being in the EU, Britain is no longer safe or free. I think that's cuckoo land, quite frankly. So, very briefly, at the minute the law says Halloween we leave, deal or no deal. And that's the debate. The debate is the Remainers in the House of Commons do not want no deal. I understand that because it's hugely uncertain and we don't know whether that will lead to recession. It's quite possible. Currency markets, money markets don't like uncertainty. But the sticking point really for Conservatives and for a handful of Labourites, not very many, is this issue of the single market rules and the Irish backstop and what happens when we're not in regulatory alignment. And the current deal, Theresa May's deal, as you will recall, basically proposed a disaggregation of the United Kingdom, the three nations of Great Britain, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and the fourth nation of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland. So that would be in regulatory alignment with the Republic of Ireland on the island of Ireland, and it would disaggregate. There would be in effect a border down the Irish Sea. So you'd be like disaggregating. It's basically like saying, okay, well, what we'll have kind of like all the US states in one economic system, but we'll take Maryland and we'll take Virginia, and we'll say that will be in a different economic system. And so that's questioning the constitutional integrity of a sovereign nation state. And so that is obviously, if you're a member of the Conservative and Unionist Party, then you believe in the union. And so for them, that's the sticking point. The 39 billion, that's the cost of doing business. So it's like, well, okay, a deal for Britain to leave, a negotiated deal, which I think was what most people would prefer. It would have cost 39 billion, not just in pension contributions, but in actual commitments Britain has made. That is now off the table. Boris Johnson is saying, you know, I'm not going to give you any money, I'm not going to give you anything at all unless you make an exception for the United Kingdom over the Irish backstop. If you do that, then we can talk. The criticisms of many people, of Theresa May by many people, left, right and centre, is that straight away she said no deal is off the table. Initially she said a good deal's better than, and she said no deal's better than a bad deal, but then she reneged on that in her Chequers speech. And that was very difficult because she ended up saying to the EU, actually, we're not willing to walk away, we're to have no deal. So you know that we're actually quite weak on that, and you know our hand. And I just think that was very just poor negotiation. And so, obviously, quite rationally, France and Germany, Merkel and Macron say, no, I don't think, and the negotiators, we're not going to reopen this deal because we know that you don't really want the uncertainty of a no deal, so we're going to leave it. And I think also, to give the EU its due, it would be Britain is asking for a very significant exception, because part of the United Kingdom has a contiguous land border with an EU member state, the Republic of Ireland. But that said, for all of us who know anything about the EU, it's full of exceptions. It's full of little coders and little particular situations here and particular situations there. And that's the nature of having a 28 federal system where you have to sort of like horse trade and do business. So Boris Johnson was doing shuttle diplomacy forward and back, but I don't really think much has been achieved by that. Okay, Europe, the United States and Britain. Europe. Brexit and the prospect of it is still an existential threat to the federal project of the EU. I think what's been very clear is that it's very hard to leave the EU. So in one sense, for European federalists, I think that's a very good thing. There's a high cost to leave. There are high barriers to exit. But it is an existential threat because Britain is a large economy, and for those people who want more market-led reform in the EU, and they are more than you might think, Britain is the most liberalised, liberal capital kind of nation within the EU, and it's leaving. And there is tension between Paris and Germany, because Britain not held the balance of power, but was able to broker some of the difficulty, particularly in an era where the German economy and the German present has become hegemonic within the project. So it is a threat, I think, to the EU. And it also, therefore, because of that, leads to large economic uncertainty within the bloc, where you have 2 or 3 different economic speeds and nations at different stages of the business cycle. Think Germany, think Greece, think Italy. I also think it strengthens nationalist demands within those existing member states. Now, the nationalism is not of one ilk, it's not of one type. The most frightening form is an ethno-nationalism that we're probably all aware of. But other forms of nationalism are more kind of cultural or civic, and emphasise perhaps a desire to be outside of federal politics, like we have mainly on the Leave campaign in Britain. For the United States, I think there is a great opportunity for increased trade and an opportunity for a competitive advantage if Britain leaves the EU. Increased trade with Britain, free trade agreement, and an opportunity to put pressure on Britain, actually, because Britain will be competing with the US for trading goods in certain markets. Britain won't be part of the EU bloc. It'll have an EU free trade agreement, one would hope. So I think actually strategically that's quite good for the US. I guess if you want to say on the debit side for the US, and I guess this depends on where your politics sits regarding the US administration, there have been increasing tensions, I think, with France and Germany. And President Trump is idiosyncratic and doesn't follow traditional Republican playbook, I think, regarding international relations and diplomacy, but I think there are increased tensions, and so I think because of that it's quite important that the US federal government cultivates a close relationship with the United Kingdom and the current Prime Minister, if he stays Prime Minister after the next general election. So finally for Europe, for Britain, the impact on the United Kingdom. It is true what Jeroen said in his opening remarks. I was a pro-European for much of my adult life, from undergraduate days to graduate study with a Labour member of the House of Lords who was a political philosopher, to being involved in a range of politics and political groups. I've become more increasingly Eurosceptic over the 5 years, and I'm a fully fledged leaver, which means I'm quite a rare beast in academia and the academy, which is overwhelmingly Remain. I mean, overwhelmingly. So I'm pushing for the whole sort of diversity of opinion and accepting more than one idea. And what I love about the IES is that there's a very good old-fashioned small L liberalism, which you often don't find in many parts of the academy these days, which I find really quite stifling and you know, etatiste and top down. And so I've actually had a journey I've become more Eurosceptic. But so in one sense, I think actually there is a positive vision for British politics outside of the European Union. But I'm also quite pessimistic. I'm pessimistic because I think since 2016, the ties that bind citizens and subjects in the United Kingdom have loosened. I think we have seen the debasement of our public discourse and our civil discussions. I'm very pessimistic that this can really get much better. I think there's intergenerational tension. I think there's profound tension between people who live in the very large cosmopolitan cities and the well-known university towns of Oxford, Cambridge and Edinburgh and places like that, and people who live in provincial towns, manufacturing towns, things like this, and the countryside. And I think ultimately there's a values gap. I think this is very bad for the Labour Party, who really need a lot of blue-collar working class voters who are quite instinctively, at least a third of them, if polling is to be believed, Eurosceptic. And yet these progressive politicians knock on the door at election time and say, we need your vote to stop the Tories. And that's right, but when people raise issues that they're concerned about connected with the EU, like mass low-skill and no-skill EU migration, or seemingly the fact that Britain is a net contributor financially to the EU, so we give more than we get back, you know, a lot of these people say, well, what have you done for me lately? And so there's a difficulty, I think, for the progressive elites who knock on the door, quite understandably, and try and get votes, but don't really respect the values on this most central issue of the day of many people whose vote they're seeking, which is actually to be an independent country once again. So I think that's a real problem for the centre-left and for the Labour Party. And I think we are seeing irreconcilable division. I think there's a lack of toleration on both sides. We all know that there's been an excuse by the extreme right to trade on fears about immigrants during the referendum and since. And there's also a real problem on the Labour left and in the Labour Party with anti-Semitism. As people have left the Labour Party, Labour MPs who are Jewish, Labour peers who are Jewish have left the Labour Party. There's been reports. So there are real problems around the lack of toleration about difference. But on top of that, I think what we're seeing is cultural realignment, not partisan de-alignment and people switching parties from one party to another, but a cultural realignment. I think really in British politics, it matters much less now whether historically you're Labour or Tory. I really think the moniker, the descriptor, the key determining factor is whether you'll leave or whether you'll remain. And that's going to carry on, I think, for a generation to come. And I think if it's incumbent upon academics and scholars to try and contribute to a rich free exchange of ideas, listening to more than one idea, and to try and have the politics of conversation, someone once said, because we really are at a crossroads in British political and constitutional life. Thank you very much.